about Boolean rates and we'll talk about revenue, but we'll actually do something that will allow us to build a coalition. And as we do that, there are a number of considerations to ponder. How do we ensure that we get sufficient ambition that this carbon tax really reduces emissions? Because we know that we're going to need pretty high tax rates for deep decarbonization. We also know that it's a lot easier to legislate a $20 per ton carbon tax that gets us money to help pay for corporate tax reform, but doesn't really do a lot for reducing emissions. That's the concern of environmentalists, and that's why a lot of the environmental groups would not necessarily be supportive. I have 5 minutes. I've been talking for 15 minutes. That can't be true. Okay. So all my practice, this is quite incredible. Okay. So how do you do this? So there are a couple of approaches you can take. One is you could have the tax rate adjust automatically to interim benchmarks. If we're not reducing emissions rapidly enough, then the tax, based on legislation, starts increasing at a much more rapid rate. And this was something I wrote about and developed something called the REACT proposal. So you have 5-year benchmarks, presumably, or something like that, and then the tax rate adjusts so that if we're not getting enough emission reductions, we speed it up. And this is actually something the Swiss have done with their Swiss carbon tax ordinance. And the other thing you can do is, of course, the Republicans want to eliminate the Clean Power Plan as a quid pro quo for a carbon tax. But I think you would definitely want to keep in the legislation that the Clean Power Plan is a fallback if targets aren't met. If you have interim targets, then the Clean Power Plan comes back. So moving to looking at the revenue, so Steve Koonin was a little bit concerned about giving a lot of revenue to the federal government in his talk on Monday night. And even at a $20 per ton carbon tax, you're looking at collecting upwards of $300 billion by 2050 when the rate gets to $80 per ton. And if you actually want more serious carbon taxes, then you need higher rates and you're collecting more revenue. So that suggests something, what I call a mezzanine approach based on the notion of mezzanine finance. The idea is that if we have a carbon tax, we could start it at some rate, and the first tranche of revenue, let's say the first chunk of revenue, say $100 billion, is dedicated to 2 things in particular. Tax reform, whether it be corporate tax reform or personal income tax or whatever you want to use it for, as well as transitional assistance to the coal industry would be devastated by a significant carbon tax. So you may want to provide some transitional assistance for that locked-in human capital. And then as you collect additional revenues over time, this is an idea that Ted Halstead, an environmental sort of entrepreneur, has been promoting heavily. And so I'm sort of mulling over this idea. I'm curious about people's reactions. The additional revenues are rebated to households or individuals in a lump sum fashion. The benefit of this, Halstead argues, is that it's a highly visible, transparent way of returning the money, and that this is a necessary condition, he argues, for getting ambitious carbon tax rates. If you look, everyone talks about British Columbia as a successful example of a carbon tax. Their carbon tax is $30 a ton, Canadian. So $30 a ton. That's not sufficiently ambitious. Of course, they're a province. They shouldn't be doing such high carbon taxes. But they even British Columbia, which has a pretty good carbon tax, it's hard to argue that that it's going to be sufficiently ambitious. So Halstead argues, and I think there's some merit to this, is that if we take those additional revenues over that first tranche, return them in very visible ways to households, it's a way to ensure that to deal with the distrust the government's just going to spend the money or take it and give it to their pals and not give it back. The key element, though, whether it's this approach or another approach, is it has to be revenue neutral so that you're disentangling arguments over climate policy from arguments over the optimal size of government or optimal spending of government. So I'm going to wrap up. As I think about carbon pricing, I have my own tripod. Dan had a tripod last night. Mine's a carbon pricing tripod. I think there are 3 things you want to do. You want to enhance efficiency in the tax code of the revenue. And so tax reform, using some of the revenues for tax reform, does that. You want to maintain equity in the tax code, and the carbon tax rebates will offset the regressivity of the carbon tax, the fact that it disproportionately impacts low-income households. In fact, if you take the Halstead proposal, the household rebates, that actually injects additional progressivity into the tax code. And then you need some transitional assistance, which needs to be targeted and temporary. So let me just quickly skim. I'm going to go over this next stuff. One quick comment on R&D. We heard some good comments yesterday about the fact that we're underinvesting in R&D. There is a cylinder problem, which I think I don't quite know what the right political solution to this. The cylinder problem is that if we want government to do R&D, we want them to be doing really, really high-risk stuff that even the private sector doesn't want to do. And those really, really high-risk stuff means that there's going to be a whole bunch of failures. If we don't have a bunch of failures, then it's not high risk, and we're not spending the money appropriately. But if you have a bunch of failures, every failure gives an opponent of these kinds of programs an opportunity to say, see, we're wasting taxpayer money because of these failures. They're not focused on the moonshot that actually is successful. They're focusing on the failures. So there's some education that needs to be done around that. And then in terms of innovative approaches to R&D, I think there are things we could do, including, for example, tournaments around carbon capture and sequestration. We could give significant revenues to the first 5 million tons of successfully sequestered carbon. And you could also, another thing I think is worth thinking about is having a government guaranteed payment price floor for stored carbon. The idea is that, so for the private sector to do CCS, they have to have a return on that. And the return is the avoided carbon tax that would be paid. But the policy risk is that Congress doesn't actually enact a sufficiently ambitious carbon tax. So by having a price floor, a payment price floor, the government says, we will pay you, we stand ready to pay you $40 a ton if the carbon tax falls below that level, then it provides the return that's needed to make this a viable business. So to wrap up, I think it's easy to design a carbon tax. It's hard to implement, and it's even harder to implement a meaningful carbon tax, but that's what we're going to have to do. So we're going to have to think about the political constraints and pressures to do that. I didn't talk about the current tax treatment of domestic oil and gas. I'll just simply say it's a bad idea. We can save $4 billion at no great loss. I'm happy to talk about that. And R&D is underfunded, but we need, we should do more, but we also want smart R&D initiatives, clever new ideas. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.